Well, if statistics were kept on these sort of things, I suspect that 90% or so of all the arguments and tears and hurt feelings that our kids experience are a result of things that really, ultimately, are not the least bit important. For example, let me ask you this. Did you or your kids ever keep track of how many times each of them got to sit in the front seat of the car? Did you ever have that argument before? When our kids were younger, I would, in an effort to keep the peace, play along with this and make sure that each kid got a turn in the front seat on their particular day. That, as it turned out, wasn't always good enough. They always kept track of how long each person got to sit in the front seat and how many times in the last week each person got to sit in the front seat. And what really complicated matters is when Brenda insisted on taking a turn in the front seat of our car. Well, inevitably, I would tire of the bickering and arguing. I'd say something like that. That's it. Nobody sits in the front seat. All of you will sit in the back. And so if you ever saw me driving along with Ryan and Kelsey and Stephanie and Brenda squished into the back seat, now you know why that happened. I actually have the conviction that one of the main jobs that we have as parents is to teach our kids what is important and what isn't. Here's another example from when our kids were younger. We would be driving along and one of them would say something like this. Oh, I see a rainbow. This is back in the days when it rained, by the way, just if you can remember that. And then another child would say, I see it too. And then what would the first one say? I saw it first. I saw it first, but I just didn't say anything. Now, before long, there's going to be an all-out war in the van over who saw the rainbow first, including some mean words and tears, which is always followed by this lecture from Dad. Guys, it doesn't matter who saw the rainbow first. What's important is that we saw the rainbow. It doesn't matter whether Ryan saw it first or whether Kelsey saw it first. What matters is we saw this beautiful rainbow that God put in the sky to remind us of His love for us. And besides, I'm the only one in the front seat, so I saw it first. But, it isn't just kids who make this habit of draining the joy out of life by fretting over things that, in the big scheme of things, just aren't that important. One of the arguments that Brenda and I have had for almost 35 years now, an entire marriage, has been about the arrangement of the furniture in the family room. Anybody else have this sort of argument before? The reason we argue about it is because I think it's very important that my favorite seat be perfectly positioned so that I can see the TV. And now I've given you, just as a public service, an example of the right way to set up the furniture in the family room and the wrong way to set up the furniture. You see the wrong way where people are facing each other rather than the TV. In fact, there's no TV in that room. How would you call that a family room? At any rate. And every once in a while when we're having this discussion, I can almost picture God in His heaven, looking over the balcony of heaven and saying, you know what, guys, get a grip. This just isn't important. A couple of weeks ago, we started our study in the book of Philippians, one of Paul's letters that he wrote from prison. And we discovered that one of the cures for running on empty and running out of joy in your life is to discover the joy of belonging. We saw that Paul was able to celebrate life even while he languished in prison, in part because he discovered this particular joy, this joy of belonging to a community of people who were partners with him in God's grace and in the gospel. Now we're going to move a little bit further ahead in Philippians chapter 1, and we're going to see a second source of Paul's joy, what we're calling the joy of knowing what's important. Knowing what's important and what's not. One of my favorite authors, Max Lucado, has written just a score or so of books, and in one of his books he tells this story. It sounds like it's made up, but it's actually true, of two burglars who broke into a department store. Instead, however, of stealing anything from the department store, they decided to have some fun. So they took the price tags off of expensive items and stuck it on inexpensive items and switched everything up. A box of stationery now costs $395, and a brand new flat screen TV costs $2.95. Now, most interesting part of the story, though, is what happened after that. The store opened up and customers shopped. They picked out what they wanted. They went to the cash register to make their purchases. For 4 hours, nobody noticed that all the price tags had been switched. The employees didn't notice it. The customers didn't notice it. The managers, well, the customers might have, but they didn't say anything. The manager didn't notice it, and the cashiers didn't notice it. When they finally discovered after 4 hours what happened, the manager had to shut down the store and go to work to figure out what everything really cost. He had to get the master list to, again, figure out which items were the most expensive and which were the least expensive. And in a way, in these verses in Philippians, Paul does that same job for us. In a world that has sort of gotten the price tags about what is important and what isn't mixed up, Paul helps us identify what's really important and what isn't. And in doing so, Paul helps those of us who are running on empty to recapture some of the joy of following Jesus, the joy that Jesus promised we would have if we committed our lives to following him. Let me jump into Paul's letter and see what he has to say. This is from Philippians chapter 1. Now, I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel. As a result, it has become clear throughout the whole palace guard and to everyone else that I am in chains for Christ. Because of my chains, most of the brothers and sisters in the Lord have been encouraged to speak the word of God more courageously and fearlessly. Then he goes on to say, it's true that some preach Christ out of envy and rivalry. They've got bad motives. Others out of goodwill. The latter do so in love, knowing that I'm put here for the defense of the gospel. The former preach Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, supposing they can stir up trouble for me while I'm in chains. But what does it matter? The important thing is that in every way, whether from false motives or true, Christ is preached. And because of this, I rejoice. Now, Paul wasn't a father, to our knowledge. He had never given this lecture to his kids. But he sure sounds like a father, doesn't he, when he's given this sort of talk to the Philippians. You catch what he says at the end? But what does it matter? This isn't important. What's important is that the gospel is preached. Let me just remind you of the setting of where Paul was when he wrote this. He is in prison. This is actually his third stint in prison. Every time he's been in prison is for a reason that is totally unfair. All he had been doing was telling people that Jesus the Christ had been crucified and that he had risen from the dead. And yet he gets thrown into prison for allegedly inciting a riot. Now, Paul doesn't know it yet, but this is going to be his last time in prison, because at the end of this imprisonment, he's going to be executed. Now, to add insult to injury, some of Paul's so-called brothers and sisters in the faith, who apparently are jealous of Paul's notoriety, have decided they're going to rub salt in the wounds of Paul by taking over his preaching. The image that he gives us is that these sort of pseudo-brothers were on the outside of the prison preaching the gospel while at the same time looking over at Paul behind the bars and sort of going, yeah, nah. You know, we're doing the same thing you did. You got arrested for it, and we're not. Ha. Now, in verse 17, Paul tells us that these individuals are, quote, trying to stir up trouble for me while I am in chains. And the word Paul uses in the Greek is this word thlipsis, which means friction. It's a word commonly used in those days to describe the rubbing of chains on a prisoner's wrists and ankles. Paul is saying that these people aren't content with the fact that he's sitting in prison in chains. They are trying to take the chains and twist them back and forth to rub away the skin on his body. I had an older brother, my older brother Dave, who was a wrestler, 6 years older than me and much bigger and stronger than me. And when I was a little guy, he liked to rub my skin off, basically. Back in my day, we had a politically incorrect term called giving somebody an Indian burn, right? They can't use that anymore. But that's what my brother would do to me. He would take my wrists and just rub them back and forth until it felt like the skin was coming off. I love my brother. We're good friends. That is the image that Paul is painting for us when he says that these people were trying to stir up trouble and create friction and pain for him. The natural response now of the people who are reading this letter, of Paul's friends back in Philippi over in Greece, would be sympathy and perhaps outrage too. They would be sympathetic towards Paul because he's suffering unfairly. They'd maybe be outraged that these people are trying to rub salt in Paul's wounds. But notice Paul's response. I mean, if this was me in that situation, I would be angry, I would be bitter, I would be jealous, I'd be stressed out, I would be completely out of joy. But not Paul. Paul's response to his circumstances is this: but what does it matter? The important thing is that in every way, whether from false motives or true, Christ is preached. And because of this, I rejoice. Paul knew what was important. Paul had the big picture. He was able to step back from his circumstances and view them from the perspective of God in heaven. He saw his life from God's perspective. And here's what he saw: that the gospel, the message of Jesus, was being communicated to lost people. People who faced an eternity in hell. People whose lives had been ruined by bad choices. People who had given up hope. These people that Jesus loved enough to die for were hearing for the very first time in their lives the message about who Jesus was. For the first time, they were hearing that God came to earth in the person of his Son, Jesus, as a man, so we could know God personally. For the first time, they were hearing that in the person of Jesus, God walked on this earth, that he lived a life of integrity and honor and dignity and compassion, that he healed the sick, that he gave sight to the blind, that he actually raised the dead, that he calmed the storm with a single word. For the first time, they were hearing that Jesus was crucified on a cross to pay the penalty for their sin, that because of Jesus' death, they could be free from the guilt that had shackled their souls and diminished their spirits. For the very first time, they were hearing that this Jesus rose back to life after 3 days in the grave. For the first time, they were hearing that through Jesus, they could know God. Through Jesus, they could have eternal life. Through Jesus, they could experience real and enduring joy. And as Paul viewed his circumstances from the balcony of heaven, he looked at his chains, he looked at the unfair sentence, he looked at his impending execution, and he says, what does it matter? It's not important. Here's what is important. Lost people are hearing the message of Jesus for the first time. That's what's important, and that's why I rejoice. Paul understood the joy of knowing what's important. And to Paul, the fact that people were hearing the message of Jesus because he was in prison, well, that was what was important. You know, on June 14th, just a month ago, we lost one of the greatest Christians of the last 100 years. Her name was Elisabeth Elliot. When she was still in her 20s, Elisabeth Elliot and her husband Jim moved from Illinois to Ecuador in an effort to take the message of the gospel to a people group who had never even heard about Jesus before. It turned out that these people, called at the time the Auca Indians, were a particularly violent people. But that didn't deter the Elliots or 4 other missionary couples from setting out to try to establish contact with the Aucas so they could learn their language and so they could tell them about Jesus. And you may recall what happened. Elizabeth wrote about the story in one of the most important Christian books of the 20th century. It's called Through Gates of Splendor. In January of 1956, Jim Elliot and 4 others camped out nearby an Auca camp. They had made a sighting of some Auca people, and so they decided to take their little biplane in. They landed there by this little river and set up camp to wait for the Aucas to come to visit them. They never made it home. All 5 of them were speared and hacked to death by the Auca Indians. Elisabeth Elliot was 30 years old at the time. She had a 10-month-old daughter. Do you remember what she did? She stayed. First, she stayed there to learn the Auca language. And then 2 years later, in 1958, she took her 3-year-old daughter, and then with another woman, Rachel Saint, the 3 of them went to live with the Aucas, to move in with them. Why? In the words of Paul, but what does it matter? The important thing is that in every way, whether from false motives or true, Christ is preached. And because of this, I rejoice. What mattered to Elizabeth, what mattered to Rachel Saint, was that the gospel be preached to the Aucas. And if you remember the story, and it's a great story, and I encourage you to read it, by and large, the whole tribe eventually came to put their faith in Christ. And before he died, Jim Elliot kept a journal, and sometime after his death, Elizabeth discovered this, one of these entries became sort of a famous saying from that time. Here's what Jim wrote. He is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose. He is no fool who gives what he cannot keep to gain what he cannot lose. Elizabeth Elliot understood very clearly what was important and what wasn't. So if you were to make a list of what really matters in your life, what would be on your list? What are the essentials in life that fulfill you and satisfy you and bring you joy, even if everything else in your life is not going so well? Well, in the last few verses of Philippians 1, Paul identifies a few more items on his list of essentials, on his catalog of what really matters and what doesn't. He identifies two of them in one short verse. It's one of the best known verses of the book of Philippians, verse 21 of the first chapter. For to me, he writes, to live is Christ, and to die is gain. In Paul's pantheon of values, there was one overriding essential, and it was his relationship with Jesus. For Paul, life was all about knowing and loving and enjoying and following Jesus. As long as Paul stayed connected to Jesus, his life was full, even when from all appearances, he should be running on empty. You know, like most of you guys, I shave every morning. I happen to use a rechargeable electric shaver. And every once in a while, I choose not to do it at home, and I'll bring my shaver with me. I used to shave in the car a lot. I don't do that anymore. Try not to drive distractedly and try not to litter my car with my shavings. So I'll usually do it here at church up in my office. So I should vacuum. But and then I'll leave it here for a few days, and I'll keep shaving here. And that works fine for a while. But if I do that too long, you know, what happens? You know, the shaver just stops because it's running on empty. And what do I have to do? I have to plug it back in again. And as long as it stays engaged with its source of power, it keeps on going. All Paul needed, he said, to keep on going was to stay connected with Jesus. Having a relationship with Jesus that kept him fresh and alive and full of joy, even when it seemed that he would be running on empty, that's all it took. So how do we do that? How do we stay connected to Jesus? Well, part of the process, I think, is to stay involved in a church. To come to a place like Cornerstone or some other church that teaches the Bible and learn what the Bible has to say about the person and the message of Jesus. But the truth is, and we all know this, if all we do is come to church an hour a week or a couple times a month, pretty soon our spiritual batteries are going to go dead. The only way to stay fresh and full of joy is to reconnect with Jesus every day. To read our Bible a little bit every day, to pray every day. So if you're feeling a little bit like you're running on empty in your relationship with God, if following Jesus seems more like a chore than an adventure, check your connections. Make sure you're staying plugged in. Well, then Paul says this. He says, to me, to live is Christ. That's what's really important. And to die, well, to die is gain. Now, you can't say that if you don't know what's going to happen when you die. If you are of the attitude that death is a bridge that you can cross when you get there, you can't say it's a gain to die. But in Paul's value system, death was gain because he knew that when he died, he would be in heaven. In Paul's view, the fact that he had been unjustly put in prison really didn't matter. The fact that his arms and his legs were in chains really didn't matter. The fact that some pseudo-brothers were doing their best to make his life miserable didn't matter. The fact that he was going to be executed didn't matter. But heaven mattered. You know, when you think about it, Paul really had a great way to figure out what matters and what doesn't in life. Because what I think he did was to sort of evaluate his life here from the perspective of the afterlife. Have you ever been asked this question? Probably not, but maybe. What do you want to be put on your tombstone? My favorite answer is, I told you I was sick. It's an actual tombstone. And you see another example up there, too. Well, Paul takes it one step further than just imagining what he wants on his tombstone. In essence, he says, suppose, Paul, that you're dead now, you're looking back on your life from the other side of eternity. What would really matter to you? And Paul very wisely thought, you know what? It matters to me that when I die, I go to heaven and not to hell. It matters for two reasons. The first, of course, is the alternative. According to the Bible, the alternative to heaven is hell. And no matter what image that might come to your mind when you think of hell, whether it's a kitchen full of chocolate chip cookies and no milk, or a playground covered thick with black crows, the Bible is very clear about this, that hell is a horrible place to spend the rest of eternity. But heaven also matters, not just because it's not hell, but because it's heaven. Think about this from Paul's perspective. In heaven, he will never wear chains. He will never again watch the sun set from between prison bars. He will never have to eat simply moldy bread and old water. He will never be cold. He will never be sick. He will never be separated from the people that he loves. He will never run on empty. In heaven, Paul's joy will always be full. Paul understood this. Heaven matters. But there's still a couple more things on his list of what matters. Let me go on a few more verses. And starting in verse 23, Paul says this, I am torn between the two. I desire to depart, and when he says depart, he's talking about dying, and to be with Christ, which is better by far. But it is necessary for you that I remain in the body. Convinced of this, I know that I will remain, and I will continue with all of you for your progress and joy in the faith, so that through my being with you again, your joy in Christ Jesus will overflow on account of me. You know, you can't help but empathize with Paul. After 3 trips to a crummy first-century prison, you can't blame Paul for wanting to take the next shuttle to heaven, to exit stage left, as we say. But Paul decides, he says, nope, I'm not ready to leave yet. I am staying put. I'm staying right here, and I'm going to do everything I can to bring joy to your lives. Why? Because you matter. Paul knew what was important. The gospel mattered. He understood. His relationship with Jesus mattered. That was what life was all about, knowing and loving and following Jesus. Third, heaven mattered to Paul. And so he made sure he had made his reservations. He made sure that he knew heaven was his destiny. And fourth, people mattered to Paul. You know, if you take your time to read the 4 short chapters of the book of Philippians, you can't help but see Paul's love for people. It just kind of bleeds through this whole book. And not just humankind in general, but individual people. You probably remember the old Charlie Brown cartoon where Linus says, I love humanity, it's people I can't stand. And we all know what Linus means, right? Sometimes I can feel a great compassion in my heart for people in general, but when I go through my prayer list, I inevitably will come across a person or so that I don't feel like praying for. But Paul has such a heart for people with names. In chapter 2, we'll see Paul talk about his friend Timothy, who's like a son to him. In the same chapter, he'll tell us about a guy named Epaphroditus, who's sort of a hero to Paul, he says. In chapter 3, he pleads with 2 oddly named women, Euodia and Syntyche. He tells them, get along with each other. Put their differences behind them. Later in chapter 4, he praises a man named Clement for standing by him as a partner in the faith. Paul cared for these people, and he prayed for these people, because in Paul's hierarchy of values, people mattered. And because Paul knew what was important, because he understood clearly what's important and what isn't important, Paul's reservoir of joy just never dried up, even in prison, even on the brink of death. I did a memorial service not long ago, and in that I talked about Mickey Mantle, who was one of my boyhood heroes. He was one of the greatest and most loved baseball players of all time. He hit 536 home runs in his career. He hit 18 home runs in World Series, which is still a record for the most home runs in a World Series career. Also struck out more than any other person in World Series history, but that's beside the point. He was fast, he was strong, he was handsome, he was rich. He was married, had 4 sons. He could make hundreds of thousands of dollars just writing his name on baseball cards. But if you know his story, you know that Mickey Mantle spent most of his life running on empty. From the time he was a teenager, Mickey played hard, but he also drank hard. Mickey's father died at the age of 39 from Hodgkin's disease, and Mickey was just convinced, he lived his life with the spirit that he was going to die young too. And since he had no belief in heaven or hope of heaven, no